Now that we know all the fundamentals of Emulsion 4, I want to show you what all the other actions do and how powerful they can be to take your platinums, your cyanotypes, your seleniums, and you can just really mix them. And they do their best, especially a lot of focus in this in Emulsion 4, as we go forward and make these actions more and more advanced, to emulate and really pay homage to those darkroom counterparts and get these authentic looks. Because in the end, you're making a piece of art, whether it's for the web, for Instagram, or you're putting a beautiful portrait on the wall. And so whether you're printing in a traditional darkroom or whether you're using a modern printer with monochrome inks or whatever process you're doing, the goal is to create the aesthetic that's here. And we shouldn't be limited in creating that aesthetic. And what we can do in Emulsion 4 is there's a lot more mods and mixes. Let's actually switch over. I'm going to start with a color image here, just to illustrate that we don't have to start with a black and white. So I could go to something like Blackroom on this, and then I could subsequently edit in Blackroom, and then on top of that, I could add Emulsion 4 to do the final tint and keep those separated, but together, because they work really well. Emulsion, Lumist, Blackroom, Alchemist, all the actions that we make here at Seim Effects really work together and have really been designed to integrate, but also work great separately. In this case, I'm not gonna run Blackroom. I have a color image. It's already had a preset. I believe this was a Filmist preset in Lightroom. The colors, the separation, the contrast is pretty good in this. Let's just switch over and run the Emulsion base action, where it says run this first. We're going to run that first. And you can see here that even though it was not converted to black and white, the process of Emulsion is converting that to black and white. And I have now a platinum look. This is the base look. Now that we've taken the color away, it looks a little flat, doesn't it? This is a common thing. And this is why sometimes I will convert to black and white first, or I'll use Blackroom. But not to worry, because the way we have tools in Emulsion 4 now, it's self-contained enough that you can do everything right here. So let's look at what the mod tools do. If I come to here, you can see at the top, we have the run first and the platinum remixes. We have the cyanotype, wet plate, and selenium, and then remixes for each of those. So kind of each category of the 4 primary chemical emulsions, and then we can mix and do whatever we want. Now we have the green actions, if you're in button mode here. And with the green, these are all tone related. You'll see that some of these say top mix, and some say under mix, and some say smart curve. Now, this is to make it easier for you, don't get confused. When you run the base action, you have the smart curve, and it's underneath your master tint. So as I showed you in the essentials video, if you click this curve, and you can just double click the adjustment layer in Photoshop and manually edit this curve, and the tones are going to update dynamically, because remember, just like in the darkroom, the tones that we're getting in Emulsion 4 are luminance specific tones, and that's the beauty of the gradient map system. It's applying the tint based on the tonality that it sees in your image. And so if you come down here and you're adjusting in the smart curve, it's going to adjust your tones accordingly. But you don't have to do that manually, and that's where the quick mod actions come in. So let's say I run this and I say, no, I need something a little different. It's too flat. Let's zero the smart curve. There's also an action for that. So let's start from the bottom up on these and just do a few different smart curves, like the drop light, which is darker. That's not what we want here. The lift light is lighter, but it's more like an exposure post-process lighter. I don't really want that either, because we're not really underexposed. I'm going to zero the curve again, and let's do something more like the Hue Magic Smart Curve, which actually is mixing up the reds and greens and blues a little bit, and it's adding a little bit of different hue nuancing into our platinum mix, or whatever else we are mixing this with. Let's again zero the Smart Curve. Okay, let's zero the Smart Curve, and let's do something like the Gab Smart Curve. Okay, so this, I like better. This is kind of lightening up the faces. It's giving me some contrast. This is a complex curve that a lot of times just works great. Sometimes it doesn't, and you can just reset it to 0 if you want. But I think where we did with this works good. Now bear in mind, just like any layer within Emulsion or any of our other actions, you can turn that specific effect up and down by adjusting the opacity. By default, these base curve layers are at 100%, so you can adjust them and what you see is what you get. But don't be afraid to play around and turn down that opacity a little bit if you want to. I think this is looking pretty good. Now there's some other kinds of curves in here as well though. We see that here is a wet, dry, lo-fi undermix. What does it mean by undermix? Well, let's click it and watch what happens in the layers. By undermix, it's saying I'm putting this underneath our master tint. And that's important because anything we do in the curves underneath the master tint adjuster, the tint is going to interpret. Anything we do above the master tint adjuster, the tint is not going to change. We're going to affect the contrast and the feel of the image, but the tint is reading the layers below it. So this gives us two beautiful layers of control without having to be Photoshop nerds. You just click these and it's going to put them where you need. So if we are adjusting the smart curve with the smart curve actions, these are your fundamentals and these are going to flow right along with your master tints. But if we do an under curve, it's also the same. You can see it's actually under the smart curve. So anything you do on the smart curve layer is coming after. Don't overthink this. Just know the fundamentals of it. And that's all you need to know. So this wet dry curve here, it's kind of allowing us to control the matteness of the image. And this actually helps simulate different types of paper, how satin, how glossy, the type of processing. But a lot of this goes down to paper types. A lower fidelity paper is not going to have as much detail. So if this is not on, it represents more of a normal paper. And this can be really good, and it can go along with the plates and mods. These are some other mods that you can see down here in the blue category. And each variant, each emulsion that you run in Emulsion 4 is going to set these where it wants. But don't be afraid, just like with the other options tools, to come down here and play with these. The two you're going to play with most often is paper softness. If you turn it way up, you get a very soft look that's almost too much. But a little bit of this, and then mixing that with the detail curve that's underneath it can really help you simulate different types of paper and different surfaces and textures, and how those are going to combine not only with your online prints, but with whatever paper you're printing with if you're going to actual physical prints. So these are really cool. And then your base point was just our starting point when we ran the action. Most of the time you won't need this, but there will be some times that you could go down here and you could apply other tools from Photoshop to that base layer. And even though there's layers above it, those layers are semi-transparent and using blending modes, so you can actually still affect things. We'll look at some more advanced edits in another video. Let's go back here though to our mod layers. Okay, so if you come into the mod layers now, we've seen, okay, we have the wet dry, we can do this, we have the smart curve. These are all undermix, okay? And you can see those down here at the bottom side of these tone modifying actions, which are the green ones. The beauty of Emulsion, just like Blackroom and other actions, is when you click these mods, you're not having to manually build these layers, set them up, or place them. It's putting them right where they belong, it's color coding, it's keeping everything organized within the main Emulsion folder so that you can do whatever you want with it and even adjust the overall opacity of everything together, which is really cool. Although in this case, I wouldn't do that because underneath is color. But if I was starting from a black and white image, I could easily come in here and just turn down the whole overall effect of everything together. And that can be useful at times as well. By default, that is at 100%. Okay, so let's actually go and add a top mix then. For example, the Filmic Darkroom top mix goes here. And this is working pretty good here. And you can see it's putting this red layer on top above all our other options. So this is affecting even above the other options if we've added a gold tone or a bronzing or a cooling or something like that. So this is kind of a post curve, and the same if we do like a tone thinner or something like that. A tone thinner which is kind of reminiscent of what we're going to see in the cyanotype emulsions, but it can be used on any of them. And what it also does is it gives you kind of a less dynamic range, which sometimes can be good. You might say, why would I want less dynamic range? Thinning the tone so that whites are whiter can be a very powerful effect to draw the attention where you want it to be. And again, just like when we're working in the dark room, we have different papers and chemicals and processes and pushing and pulling to give different levels of contrast and detail. You don't always want the maximum possible amount of dynamic range in a photo because it might not give you the aesthetic you want. So in Emulsion 4, we're just making that easy. Okay, so I could use the tone thinner. In this case, I like the filament curve a little better, and I'm just going to leave that filament curve on there. Now, let's say I go up here and I say, you know what, I like this, but I want a little bit more subtle platinum. I could switch to the Platinum Cafe Mix, which doesn't change a lot, but it is changing the overall tint of the image. All right, so that's one option. I'm going to turn off some of these other mod layers we added just so we're seeing the tones kind of in their base state. And I could, of course, go back to the master tint adjuster and adjust this up or down to get the effect I want of my platinum look. However, there's another one here, and this is one that I added in Emulsion 4.1. And I actually love this one. I'm using it a lot. I'm working on a street photography book of Mexico. And you know how sometimes you're debating, do I stay monochrome or do I go platinum? Do I really want something that tinted? You may have seen the work of some photographers that are doing platinum work and platinum inspired work, but it's very subtle and very rich. Photographers like Nick Brandt, the way they're using platinum is just really beautiful. And so what the Platinum Luma mix, the remixes are not to say this is some artificial platinum. These are all still inspired by real platinum, real cyanotype, etc. But they're different variants because in a real darkroom, depending on how you mix your chemicals and how you do these, they actually come out different every time. Even the paper affects all of these. So I'm going to run the Platinum Luma mix, and you can see that this is giving me a super subtle. You might have just said, well, what happened to the platinum? Well, it's still there, and I'm going to actually turn our master mix adjuster up to 100. But if you see, I turn it off and turn it on. No, it's color. Let's do it this way. Let's turn off the tint just so you can see the difference. Here's the monochrome, and here is the platinum tint. And that's what I love about this. If you want a really strong platinum look, use the base platinum or the cafe platinum. But if you want a platinum that people don't even look at and think, oh, that's tinted, it just has a beautiful richness to it, a very subtle platinum. You can, of course, turn down the opacity of any of the platinums to make them very subtle. But this Platinum Luma, the air mix here is really meant to be light and subtle, have rich tones. And then, of course, like I showed you, you can mix this however you want. So I could come down in here and use any of our mods at this point. I could also go into textures and things like that. And I could add the wet-dry mix just like I did before. I could use my filament curve, which is a top curve, and it's affecting everything above. And so I could mix this up. Now, you could drag these around. You could see if I drug the filament curve and dragged that layer below the master tint, it's not that different, but it does change how it's interpreting because we're adding that curve before the master tint. What I'm getting at is not that you need to move these. The actions are set up and named and organized to make it easy, whether you're an advanced Photoshop user or whether you barely know Photoshop and you just want to get a great emulsion look. The point is, if you want to get nerdy and play around, you can do anything you want in here. Because remember, at the end, you can always come back, go to the red action at the top, and just reset to base, and you're going to go right back to that base platinum look. In this case, though, I really like that subtle, airy Luma Platinum, and I'm probably going to stick with that on this image as I put together my street photography book. Okay, that is a look at how to use the mods, as well as a look at the different platinum emulsion modes in Emulsion 4. Let's go, and we're going to do some other videos on each of the different types of chemical emulsions, as well as some of the other ways that we can mod and mix.